Our guest this evening is Arthur Waldron. He is the Lauder Professor of International Relations in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. His specialties are the history of China and Eurasia and the history of war and violence. At Penn, he is an associate of ISTAR, the Institute for the Strategic Threat Assessment and Response, and he has been associated with the Solomon Asch Institute for the Study of Ethno-Political Conflict. Professor Waldron received his bachelor's degree in history and science from Harvard, summa cum laude, in 1971, and his PhD also from Harvard in 1981. He lived in Asia for 4 years, studying Chinese and Japanese. Earlier in his career, he had spent a year in England, a semester in France, and a semester at what was then called the Leningrad State University, from which he received a certificate in Russian language. He has also taught as visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium and been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. Professor Waldron is a prolific scholar. He has written 3 books in English, I'm emphasizing the language. He's edited 4 more, including 2 in Chinese, and produced introductions for 4 others, including 1 also in Chinese. His works have been translated repeatedly into Chinese, Italian, Korean, and Japanese. He has also authored numerous chapters in books and scholarly articles, one of which was featured on the cover of American Historical Review. He's a good colleague, too. With Professor Stuart Schramm of Harvard, he is co-editor of the Chinese Civil War volumes of the series Mao's Road to Power. And with Dr. David Parrott of Oxford, he is co-editor of Volume 4 of the forthcoming Cambridge History of War. He is currently working on a book called The Chinese, a volume for Blackwell's series Peoples of the World. Professor Waldron is a founder and vice president of the International Assessment and Strategy Center, an independent, nonpartisan research organization in Washington, D.C., devoted to work on foreign policy. He is also a regular consultant to government, having served on the congressionally mandated U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and he testifies regularly to both House and Senate committees. He has also served as an American representative to the Track 2 meetings involving Korea, China, Taiwan, Japan, and Russia. You might care to know that before going to Penn, Professor Waldron was a faculty member in the History Department and in the East Asian Studies program here at Princeton. He's accompanied this evening by his wife, Xiao Wei. His talk will be on religion and regime in contemporary China. Please give a warm welcome to Arthur Waldron.
Thank you very much, Connie, for that, how shall we say, very detailed introduction. I do have to say one thing, though, which is that I really got my education it wasn't at Harvard, it wasn't even at Princeton. Between Princeton and Harvard, I was professor at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, which is a graduate school for military and government officers and for people from 44 countries. In many ways, that was a formative experience, an absolutely formative experience. And I was just up there last week, and it was wonderful. You may wonder, maybe I'm spread a little bit thin. I seem to have I seem to have a wide variety of interests, but as John and Ruth Wilson can testify, the topic of this series has been something I've been working on, particularly with respect to China, for many years. Now, in the case of China, the first thing we start with is the character Tian. Tian means sky or heaven, and it is thought to, how do they do it in linguistics? It's thought to be related to Tengri, which is the name of the Eurasian sky god. For instance, the Mongols had a cult of Tengri, and it's thought that the Chinese cult of heaven has some relationship to that. The question of when this particular character appears in Chinese is a very vexed subject of discussion, which I will leave to my colleagues to resolve. There are those who say it doesn't appear until the first millennium before the Common Era. There are others who say that it's among the most ancient characters in Chinese. If you look at oracle bones, the first inscriptions we have in Chinese on tortoise shells and deer bones and so forth, there are little things that look sort of like this and sort of look like this. And there are all sorts of connections of them. And various authorities have said either that is Tian or that is not Tian. I have looked at them, and I don't pretend to know, but my hunch is that it probably is Tian. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I want to start with Tian because Tian, the heaven, is the source of the first, what you might call political religion in China, or the first religion or belief system which is linked to politics. And this is particularly the case because as you get into the written history, and this semester I've been teaching a seminar, one thing, when all else fails, read the original book, right? This is a 19th century translation of the Classic of Documents, which is one of the most important Chinese classics. Everything is in there. And oddly enough, I've never in any graduate school I've been associated with have I ever known of a seminar on this book. And there's very little secondary literature on it. Yet if you read it, you start saying, my goodness, this is one of the chief sources of Chinese civilization. And the concept of Tian is everywhere in it. In particular, there is the concept of Tianming. Which is usually translated as the mandate of heaven. And this little box here, that is a mouth. And it is thought that words in Chinese, such as this word, Ming, second tone versus this one, Ming, fourth tone. Don't worry, I'll get away from the linguistics in a second. You're not in for a full evening of this. But it is thought that just as in the West, there is a sort of a discredited theory that I still believe in, which says that words with L's and G's within, like ligament, those sorts of words, they have to do with joining, and that the word religion, religio, has got something to do, that the LG words have something to do with binding. The M words in archaic Chinese all have something to do with ordering. And this is indicated by this particular radical, the mouth. That little box is a mouth. The Tianming is what is, many of you will have heard of, is the mandate of heaven. And according to the legitimating documents of Chinese dynastic rule under the Confucians, the mandate, the the delegation of the authority to rule comes from heaven, and it is given to somebody who is called the Tianzi, the son of heaven, who is the emperor. And there's a very complicated interaction between heaven's will, or the mandate of heaven, and what the emperor does. The mandate is contingent on the emperor being moral. If you think of the Western idea of divine right, which is developed particularly by Justinian's tutor, someone named Deacon Agapetus, or much later by Bossuet. These are the classic texts of divine right kingship in the West. They lay stress on the fact that one must obey the king. It's no matter what. But when I read them, again, when all else fails, read the actual original document, you discover that they stress that the king is in fact human, is mortal, and is dust, and will return to dust. So they do not contain the sort of deification of the king that's associated with some other religions and other political systems that we won't go into today. According to Confucius and according to Mencius, there is no such thing as a king who is not moral. The minute that you act immorally, you forfeit the mandate of heaven, and you become what's called a ba, which is to say a tyrant or a hegemon. So at the very outset, underlying the whole Chinese concept of the state and the structure of the state and the authority of rulers is a belief that some sort of a superhuman moral order is behind it, and that if human beings or rulers violate the moral order, if they go against the mandate of heaven, then bad things happen. For instance, there will be floods, there will be storms, and so forth. Now, Western translators have been baffled by how to translate this term. Heaven is usually the way it's translated, but some people say, well, it really is a concept like God. So, for instance, James Legge, the great 19th century translator of the Chinese classics, occasionally, he usually says heaven, but sometimes he renders it as God. And this leads to a lot of discussion today about how the Chinese thought of Tian. There is a passage in the Psalms in which the psalmist condemns the idols of the heathen, which look like gods. And he says, they have eyes but see not, ears have they but hear not, neither speak they through their throats. So the question is, Tian like that? Is Tian a sort of mechanical system? We were talking today in class, I said, is it physics or is it metaphysics? Or does Tian have a mind? And if you say, look, if Tian is, for instance, in what I may read you a passage from this. Today we were reading about the second ruler of the Zhou dynasty. And there are various palace intrigues, and there are rebellions by the people whom his house, upon receiving the mandate, has subjugated. And Tian intervenes by causing a great storm to call attention to the people, to the emperor, that the emperor is somehow crossing the line. And I asked the students, how could Tian do this if Tian didn't think? Yet, nowhere in the Chinese classics is there anything like the personification of the divine or the transcendent or the supernatural or whatever you want to call it that you find in Islam, in Judaism, in Christianity, in Buddhism, in any number of other religions. Now, what happened to the theory of the mandate of heaven is that it continued. I would say that it still exists in China today. In the year, one of the ways you know that the mandate is shifting is if there are portents. And in the year 1976, which was the year that Chairman Mao died, the year started out with terrible, terrible earthquake. And the Chinese will say, well, this meant something. There's some kind of a resonance between the sort of divine order and the human order. So we're going to have something important happen. And Mao dies. In Taiwan, on the night that Chiang Kai-shek died, out of a clear sky came a thunderstorm. And exactly at the time he was dying, there was tremendous thunder and lightning. And there is a tendency in Chinese civilization, for instance, if the people are not tranquil, if the people rise up, there is a tendency to blame not the people, but to blame the ruler. The idea is that if the ruler is truly moral, then all he has to do is, as one passage puts it, and I can't quote it exactly, is fold his arms, allow his robes to fall down straight, and then all under heaven will be rightly ordered. In other words, by moral influence. These are, to me, quite sublime and profound concepts, and they have engaged the attention of Chinese and Western philosophers right up to the present day. Now, of course, in the 20th, well, let me just say one more thing. The palace in Beijing, the Forbidden City, well, it's known as the Forbidden City, but there's actually another word before it. It's not just the Forbidden City, it is the purple, Zijingcheng. And you ask, well, why is it called the purple Forbidden City? Because after all, it is painted red and it has yellow tile roofs. Well, the word doesn't mean purple. The purple refers to the North Star. And the idea is that precisely at the location, at this sort of what should we call it? Precisely at the location of the Forbidden City, there's a kind of an intersection. It's as if there's some kind of an axis that runs through the Forbidden City. So it should be translated as the polar Forbidden City. And there's a passage from Confucius in which he says, "以德行正，譬如北辰，居其位而众星拱之," which means that to carry out rule according to virtue may be compared to the North Star, which stays in its place, and all the other stars turn around it. This is a very, very basic concept, and very few people are aware of the sort of the geomantic significance of the name and the location of the Forbidden City in Peking. Well, the mandate of heaven concept came to be applied not just to individuals, but more to dynasties. So that a ruling house, for instance, the ruling house of the Zhou, would have the mandate. And mandate would then be passed from father to son until somebody got so far out of line and was so wicked and evil that the mandate was withdrawn, there'd then be a war, and somebody else would get the mandate. It was usually retrospective. You could only tell about it after the winner had won, and then you say he had the mandate. But that's not all the time. There were at least 2 occasions or 3 occasions in Chinese history when somebody who wanted to be emperor, for instance, Wang Mang in the second, he's about 3 to 23 of the Common Era, he very carefully orchestrated all of the symbols of the heavenly mandate in order to try to make it appear that he was heaven's choice. In 1916, the commander of the Qing dynasty troops, Yuan Shikai, proclaimed that he was the emperor, and he went through all the rituals, but he was nervous because there was a saying that if someone who did not have the mandate of heaven sat under certain chandeliers and sort of heavy objects and so forth, they would fall down on him. And in fact, he had them all removed before he was enthroned. Well, the mandate ended as an actively invoked aspect of Chinese rule in 1912 when the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which was a foreign China, this was the Manchus, when they were forced to abdicate in 1912. But already a new concept had come to displace the idea of the mandate of heaven, and this was the concept of what's called Shengwu, which is to say something along the line of glorious or divine martiality. And this comes with the Manchus, and it particularly comes when the Manchus conquer the Mongols. In the 18th century, they launch a genocidal war against a group of Mongols called the Dzungars, and they eventually kill all of them, with maybe one or two got away. But it's a very, very bloody war. A very good book has recently been written about it. And the concept that you display your mandate by virtue of your success in war begins to displace the moral concept that had previously existed. But the real displacement comes in the beginning of the 20th century when, for a variety of reasons, Chinese intellectuals in particular begin to turn against the whole intellectual system that had underlain their traditional dynastic system of rule. Now, of course, in the meantime, the Tianming, the concept of heaven, ceases to be a popular idea. Early on, they say heaven sees with the eyes of people, heaven hears with the ears of the people. But that concept, gradually, the concept of the mandate becomes sort of an aspect of the monarchical establishment. And the ordinary people start developing or believing in their own religions. The most Chinese, that is the only one that was invented in China as far as we can tell, is Taoism. What does Taoism have to say about government? Taoism says the best thing is if nobody knows that there's a government. Or somebody says, well, I've heard that there might be a government, but we've never really encountered it. Sadly, Taoism is the one Chinese religion that apparently was really extinguished during the period that I'm about to turn to, which is the communist period. So that although there may be some Taoists around today, many scholars believe that actual Taoist practice disappeared. Buddhism starts to come into China in the first century of the Common Era, and that is certainly the most widespread religion in China today. What is the Buddhist aspect toward government? It's fundamentally escape. That is, Buddhism says that the world is a land of suffering and that what one must do is achieve enlightenment so that one can detach oneself from the world. And when you become a Buddha, then you become enlightened and you're no longer of the world, unless you're particularly generous and you decide to become a bodhisattva, which means that you stay on earth helping other people. I'll resist going into the various aspects of Buddhism. I'm sorry, I've left out an H here. It's very interesting, and it's deeply rooted in China, although it came from India, and of course, many of the words in Chinese are simply transcriptions of Sanskrit sounds. It's enormous, one of the great examples of intercultural transfer. Judaism in China, there were Jews in China. My dear friend Morris Rasabi, who is a professor at Brooklyn at the City University of New York at Brooklyn, he makes a very good living sort of on the side going around to Jewish congregations in the area talking about the Chinese Jews. They're not really mainstream, although I was once told by a Chinese that Liu Shaoqi, who was at one point Mao's designated inheritor, was a Jew. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what was meant by that. Christianity, in the form of Nestorian Christianity, came into China in the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era, and it became particularly strong when the Mongols came in, because a lot of the Mongols were Nestorian Christians. Islam arrived first in Southeast Asia by trade, but it also arrived overland, again with the conquests of Chinggis and Hubei, and it was reinforced by Tamerlane. Although Tamerlane never conquered China, Tamerlane created a very strong Islamic presence in Central Asia. Today, you've really got two kinds of Muslims in China. You have people who are ethnic Chinese who are Muslims, and then you have people who are Turks, who were conquered by the Qing dynasty and who are also Muslims. And I just looked at the news as I was coming over, and apparently the Turks are now a little bit out of joint about things, and they're going to start causing trouble like the Tibetans. It's very... I find it very sad because none of these people really want to kill people. They don't particularly want to be killed, but somehow in China, no way has yet been found to accommodate the private practice of religion. And now let me turn to that. In the early 20th century, Chinese intellectuals turned very strongly against everything that was Chinese. Many Chinese intellectuals, not all of them, but many of the leaders, the sort of dean of Peking University, those sort of people, very influential people. They said that the only solution for China, since China's own inherited culture was defective, and that one could not build a modern society on a Chinese foundation. You had to somehow bring in a Western foundation. The only solution was to exterminate or destroy every trace of the past and then substitute Western ideas, what was called 全盘西化, total Westernization. I'm fascinated by this and also appalled by it because I have spent at least almost 40 years of my life studying Chinese. You don't study something unless you think there's something to it. And to have the professor of linguistics at Beijing University in 1916 declare that not only did Confucianism have to be abolished, that the Chinese language itself had to be abolished before China could be saved and be replaced by Esperanto. No, I'm not kidding. This is true. This is true. I'm not making this up. This shows a tremendous revulsion at one's own culture. Now, there's something in common here with iconoclastic movements elsewhere, but that, again, is not our subject. When the communists came to power, they were, of course, believers in Marxism. Marxism has no place for religion. And, of course, in the first part of the 20th century, most sociologists believed in something called the theory of secularization, which says that as people become better educated and more prosperous, they become less religious and, give them a few more years. You know the old joke about Russia. I remember when I was there and I'd go to these churches which have been made. They're always made into museums of atheism. And they'll have a kind of Foucault pendulum and all these things explaining about how science does all these wonderful things. And they'll say, well, who comes to these churches? And they'll say, well, it's nothing, just a lot of grandmothers, just a lot of old babushkas. But then, of course, we now know that Gorbachev was a secret Christian. Are you all aware of that? Quite a very, very interesting piece of news. But the trick that God played, so they say, is that God kept on making babushkas. So religion never disappeared. And in fact, many of the churches that the communists destroyed, they probably destroyed about 100,000 churches, which just on architectural grounds, cultural grounds should have been made. A lot of them are being rebuilt. And when I was on, Connie mentioned I was on this two-track mission. This was outside of Moscow. This was back when Russia, this was pre-Putin. There was still a degree of liberalization. We were staying at a former Communist Party compound, and there was a little note on the door in Russian that said, we're thinking of trying to build a church here. If you have any money, please contribute it. Well, this is remarkable given 70 years of scientific atheism and official bulldozing of religion and so forth and so on. But what touched me most, they have a little corner. They used to have something called a red corner, where they would have a little picture of Lenin, and then they'd have a kind of classics of Marxism, Leninism. They instead had books about Christianity, and one of them was called How to Pray for the Souls of Relatives Who Died Unbaptized. Well, that's a pretty deeply religious topic. Yet there was a stack of these books in Russian at this compound, which is basically used for high-level meetings. And I think what the lesson of it is the resilience of religion. I don't pretend to understand exactly what religion is or why it is resilient, but China is also a demonstration of the same thing. Initially, when the communists came to power, it was expected that religion would disappear, as the last old people who believed in it died off, and then the new young people who've been raised on the mother's milk of Marxism, Leninism, had no interest in religion. But then something was, and so there was persecution of all religions. I know more about Christianity than I know about other religions in China, but I treat Christianity very much as a kind of a sort of a thermometer or something. In other words, you figure that what's happening with Christianity is probably also happening with respect to Buddhism or other religions. And my experience has borne that out. For instance, I'm about to talk about the tremendous revival of religion in China. Well, I don't know much about the revival of Buddhism, but it is huge. It is huge. There's a temple called the Five Banyan Temple, which I visited first, I guess, in 1980 when I worked as a tour guide when I was in graduate school and when I was a sort of unpaid sort of floater here in Princeton for Lindblad Travel. And first time I went to the Five Banyan Temple, it appeared to be a sort of burned out, reinforced concrete structure with nothing in it. A few years later, I went back, and it was all freshly painted, and there were Buddha sculptures, but it was very, very new, very, very new. Looked like, it looked like the painters had just left a few hours before. The third time I went there, it was completely overgrown with creepers and vines. The walls and the ceilings were covered with the smoke of incense. The statues had aged. There was the sound of chanting as if it were immemorial coming out of the sanctuaries, and there were sort of shuffling processions of monks, and you would have imagined this had been going on for 2,000 years. In a sense, at the Five Banyan Temple, the waters had closed over the Maoist interval, and if somebody had been born in 1920 and came back in 1990, they would say nothing had changed. But in fact, from about 1965 till about 1976, all practice of religion was forbidden in China. The Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was severely persecuted. One of the archbishops, or became a cardinal, actually, Cardinal Kong, was sent to prison for many, many years. He was the Archbishop of Shanghai. Shanghai was the great center of Roman Catholicism. And not far from Shanghai, Archbishop Kong was imprisoned for about 30-some years. He was finally released. I knew a Catholic priest who was involved in dealing with him. John Paul II decided to send him a stole. That is this sort of garment that is just a thin but long piece of cloth that the priest puts around his neck. And it was a very comic scene, as Father Murphy described it, that he went, there was John Paul II, and there was this American priest, And they said, well, I want to send a stole to Archbishop Kong, Cardinal Kong, because he's cardinal in pectore. That is, he'd been made a secret cardinal. And he's now allowed to live inside the rectory at the cathedral in Shanghai. A couple of nuns came in, and then this is where I thought it was rather amusing. They open up these drawers that are somewhere in the Vatican office, and they're all full of vestments and so forth. So it's sort of like going to J Press or something. And so there's the Pope, and they say, well, what do you think about this one? And they all look at it. And they finally decide, and then they give it to the priest, and he goes over to China, and he's at a reception, and Cardinal Kong, who's probably about 90 then, is there. And there's a moment when he's by himself, and so the priest approaches him, and he says, Cardinal Kong, the Holy Father has asked me to send you just to give you this present. And he takes it and puts it in his pocket. And then he says, and he wanted me to tell you that he has never doubted your faith. And at that point, Cardinal Kong grasped Father Murphy's hand and squeezed it very, very hard. Now, the interesting thing is that it isn't just the cardinal whose faith was not shaken. The Christians of the Shanghai area are mostly very poor people who don't even own land. They live on little boats. There are lots of canals. They live on little boats. And there is a basilica that was built by the French. It's a kind of miniature version of Sacré-Cœur in Paris. It's called Basilica of Our Lady Help of Nations. And again, it's like the Five Banyan Temple. The first time I visited it, it had just been unlocked. There was a funny story because it was locked up completely during the Cultural Revolution, and yet the faithful would sneak in. And rumors began that the Blessed Virgin Mary had appeared. And this rumor spread more and more among all the Catholics in Shanghai, so more and more started appearing. So there were thousands of them wanting to go to into the forbidden confines of the basilica. So finally the party decided that they had to do something about it. So they published something in the paper saying, and as for the rumors of mystical apparitions at this disused sort of temple of superstition, they have no basis whatsoever. They're invented out of whole cloth, and they are contrary to reason and fact, which the Catholics of China took as being authoritative confirmation that the Blessed Virgin Mary had in fact appeared there. So the problem got much worse. Well, two things have emerged, I would say. On the one hand, the ruling system of China there is no moral component to communist rule. If you ask what are communist ethics are at best utilitarian. At worst, they simply say, we know the secret of history, so therefore we have the right to make you do whatever we want you to do. But it is very difficult to form a human community which does not have some sort of shared basis about values. I mean, in America, I think Professor Wilson's talking about, we have a civic religion. It's not a religion, but it has symbols, it has texts. Good old Jefferson was a sort of a deist and so forth, so we sort of, that one, whatever, kind of thing. Never actually come around and say God, but that was enough. And as a result, many theorists of politics believe that there has to be a kind of a social consensus before you can get a political consensus. And one of the remarkable ideas, as we were saying just before we came over, is that in the United States we have all sorts of religions and they all seem to coexist. And one reason for that is that the state has neither sought to abolish religion nor has the state sought to impose a religion. In China, for almost 10 years, the state attempted to destroy all religions, whether they were imported from India like Buddhism, or whether they had come from the Middle East like Christianity, whether they were indigenous like Taoism. They were all crushed, and there are many, many very, very moving accounts of this. But if you crush the basis of your moral order in society, the popular practice of religion, and if your rulers have no articulated ethical theories, then you begin to get a moral vacuum. Nobody really knows the difference between right and wrong. Now, a friend of mine who is a Unitarian minister up near Boston, a man of great brilliance, explains that after the American Civil War, many members of our elite came to the conclusion that nothing was worth shedding so much blood over. So you had people like Justice Holmes, who were very, very pragmatic, very, very skeptical of religion. There's a whole generation or two generations after the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War also leads to a revival of religion. That's when you get sunrise services on Easter and so forth. But in the elite, it's a disillusioning experience which discredits not just religion, but also political extremism. I mean, the idea of freeing slaves is a destabilizing and extreme idea, and it's not worth 600,000 dead to do it. But then, as my friend says, we come to World War II and we encounter the Holocaust. And it's very difficult to look at the Holocaust and say, well, this is a matter of preference. Of course, it would not be my preference to do this. But if it is the preference of the Germans, this is what they are culturally, they feel that this is congenial and it's appropriate, then I really have no stance from which I can criticize this and call this wrong. And it was really the encounter. There was he's now dead, but Professor Richard Challoner here at Princeton told me about how he had been in World War II, campaigning in Europe, and he considered that all the propaganda about how bad the Nazis were, and by 1942 the death camps were known, he thought it was just all nonsense and malarkey. He didn't believe a word of it. He just thought it was propaganda. And then one day his unit broke down the doors, not of a death camp, but of a sort of a gathering place, and there were all of these half-dead human skeletons, barely breathing, and he described this as one of the most shocking experiences of his life. Well, the point is that these issues of right and wrong have to be dealt with. My philosopher friends tell me that in philosophy, ethics is the most, how should we say, it is the area of philosophy that is the most decayed, where there's the most disagreement. And of course, philosophers don't agree about anything these days. So in China, what has happened is that what the Chinese refer to as a moral or a spiritual or a values vacuum has developed. People really do anything. People do not have internalized concepts of right and wrong. Money is, yes, well, what's good? What's good? Well, what is the good? Well, it's the advantage of the strong, as in the Platonic dialogue. What's good? Money's good. The more money, the better. How you get it doesn't matter. So on the one hand, you have a really rather worrying implosion of Chinese values. For instance, the Chinese family has always been, I describe it as the lifeboat with which the Chinese people have survived turbulent times. Now Chinese families are beginning to break down at an amazing rate. Now they weren't all models of sort of connubial bliss by any means, but the divorce rate is soaring. The easy availability of desperately poor rural women exercises an appeal that many married men can't resist, and this then undermines the marriages. So there is a sense of chaos, of moral chaos. That is one thing, and I think this is very worrying for the future of China. But at the same time, there is also an astonishing revival of religion, which has caught everybody by surprise. I was on a trip and I said, look, it's Sunday, some of our people would like to go to the Protestant church. And the guy brightened and said, oh yes, I know exactly where it is. So we got in the car and we went, and there was just right out of, I don't know, some Hollywood central casting, some wonderful little Christmas story. Here was this perfect little church with kind of gray walls and red tile roof. Might have held 50 people. It was actually a chapel that had been built for some religious dignitary, but it wasn't ever. He said, this is the Protestant church. You can come worship here. And then somebody said, no. They said to the guy, this isn't it. It isn't here anymore. He said, what are you talking about? This is always no, it's not here. So he said, then he comes up and said, well, I'm very sorry, but they've moved it. So then we went on a wild goose chase, and we came in to a compound of a university or a school, and there was one of these great big old octagonal prayer halls that would probably hold several thousand people from the 19th century. You know what Christian Science churches looked like in the old, I don't know if we have any around Princeton, but I mean, huge, with room for thousands and thousands of people. And that was where the Protestant church had moved to because they simply could not accommodate everybody. A close friend of my family, I describe her as my sister-in-law, although she isn't exactly my sister-in-law, is a woman no longer as young as she was, but let me just say this about her. She is no angel, okay? She is definitely no angel, although I believe that she is good-hearted. She was baptized as a Christian in a bathtub in a house church in Peking. I know other people who are high communist officials or medium-level communist officials who are Buddhists. If religion is reaching people like this, then you know that it is vibrant. I went back to the Basilica outside of Shanghai. I've been there 3 times. The 3rd time I was there, I got there at 9 in the morning. The Mass had just ended, and there were just thousands of people pouring out. In very high spirits, many of them carrying orchestral instruments. They'd obviously had wonderful music. The place has been rebuilt. All kinds of young priests and nuns, a tremendous vigor. And frankly, nobody has any idea. I mean, the government has no idea how to deal with it. I think just leave them alone. I mean, they're not going to do anything. Although at a certain level, they do pose a moral challenge. Now, just to conclude, Connie told about some of my connections with the government and so forth, and I happened to learn that our intelligence agencies had gotten hold of a document listing the main threats to public order in, I believe, Zhejiang province, which is one of the most wealthy and developed provinces of southeast China. And they were in order underground Christianity. Underground Christianity has got nothing to do with Westerners. It is something that was in the population. There were believers in the population. It spread, and they're now all over the place. And the Public Security Bureau they have no idea what to do with it because it cannot be co-opted. They were very successful in co-opting sort of social gospel Protestantism and sort of liberal Catholicism, but they cannot co-opt these people. These people are, they have a rather jaundiced view of the party's role in religion. The second threat was the Falun Gong. Now, Falun Gong, how many of you have heard of Falun Gong? Okay. This group is vilified and persecuted in China. It is thought with good evidence that, if you need a new kidney, China's the place to go and get one. There are thought to be prisons where Falun Gong prisoners are kept, and then they're shot to order so that you get you get a fresh kidney from a young, vigorous person. I know a good deal about the Falun Gong. I know some of the practitioners. The first thing is that for those of us in this room who know anything about the religions of the book, Judaism, Catholicism, and Christianity and Islam, Falun Gong is very different. It's very different. It's based on meditation. It's based on contemplation, practice. It's very different. But if you know anything about Chinese religions, you look at it and you say, bingo, this is it. This is definitely a Chinese religion, even though we can trace its origin to the 1960s and to a particular man. But it has spread, and it's strong as far as we can tell in the army. It's very strong overseas. And when I told my friend that they were only the number 2 threat in Zhejiang, he was rather disappointed about that. He thinks that Falun Gong should be the number 1 threat. But again, all they want to do is meditate. I mean, they're not trying to overthrow the government. Although they do have an attitude, they say, look, the communists are going to disappear sooner or later. And what we want to do is to fill the moral vacuum, soothe and heal the people who are wounded, and keep people from being harmed and damaged. We want to save people from communism. But we're not anti-communist. We just feel that we have to minister to individuals so that they won't be consumed by this. And then, just so you understand that politics hasn't disappeared completely, the third threat was the so-called Revolutionary Committee of the Kuomintang, of the Nationalist Party. That is to say, there are people in China who believe that Sun Yat-sen had better ideas for China than Mao had. And they have started their own version of the political party that fled to Taiwan in 1949. There may be some very slight connection, but this is, again, this is an indigenous product. So China, in many ways, presents a situation in which religion or some sort of belief and moral system had informed governance for thousands of years. Where that system was then destroyed and replaced with a system which was once thought. I mean, my grandfather was born in 1883, the year Marx died, and it wasn't really until the 1990s that Marxism disappeared as a kind of hegemonic intellectual influence. I mean, it's now, I said this to the students at Penn in the historiography introductory course. I said, of course, and now we've lived to see it go down the drain. They weren't very happy with me. I realized that it lives on in academia. But it doesn't, I mean, out there in the real world, it isn't very strong. And in particular, it doesn't answer the questions of life. So in China, and this is how I would conclude, we see on the one hand the failure of a government which does not, in some sense, support a moral order. There's got to be some sort of legitimation of the moral order by the government and legitimation of the government by the moral order. You've got to have both of those things. We've seen the vacuum that is created when that happens, and we have also seen the extraordinary way that ordinary people fill that vacuum by inventing or discovering or having revealed to them new religions or breathing life, blowing on the embers of religions that were thought long ago to have been extinguished. Well, thank you very much. I think we've got some time for questions. Thank you. Who has a question? Yes, sir.
How is China, as it moves into various parts of the world and does development, like especially in Africa, how are they going to deal with the indigenous religions there?
Well, I think their basic approach is to try to avoid dealing with that sort of thing. And this is actually, I'm going to seem tangential in the way I answer this, but Chinese diplomats, for instance, who are sent to the Middle East, are trained very well in Arabic, but they're not trained in European languages. Those who are sent to Africa, say, will be trained in French, but they won't be trained in other things. There's a tremendous attempt to control things by compartmentalizing or narrowing your skills so that you don't have a skill set that enables you to look at the whole range of things. I doubt that there are serious courses given about religion in Africa, even though this is a tremendously important topic. Something of the officially imposed ignorance about religion is becoming evident now in the popular press in discussions of what Tibetan Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, is all about. Of course, the Qing royal house particularly valued Tantric Buddhism. But much of what is said now about the religion of Tibet is just, it's the grossest kind of caricature. So I think that you're not going to find that the Chinese operating in the field, of course you never know what they're really thinking. This is very important, but you never know. They're not going to come with a deep cultural understanding. They're going to be shooting for something particular. Can we get chromium? You know, can we get oil? Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm a little surprised to hear you, let's say, denigrate the values in communism as opposed to, say, the values in the Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic Bibles or books or scriptures. Those latter three are, starting with the flood, are pretty violent
So you're going to quote to me Samuel, and so Samuel hewed Agag into pieces before the Lord at Gilgal.
Whereas at least the English version of the Chinese Constitution has a lot of enviable qualities.
Oh, indeed it does.
Now, whether they're followed or not is another.
That's the difficult part.
Okay, well, but that's, the fact is that the values are there. The values are in Confucius. The value, much more so than they are in the Old Testament, New Testament, and the Quran.
Well, I think to some extent that's a fair point, and it's interesting to me that even a society, a regime as repressive as China's, has to vest everything that it does in the language of liberation, of tolerance, and so forth and so on. I think technically my point about Marxism is this: just as Marx believes that there's no such thing as politics except as the product of economic contradictions, I don't believe that Marx, at least in Capital, or in some, would acknowledge the existence of moral values independent of the relationships of production. However, I think Marx as an individual clearly felt outrage at many of the things that he saw around him. And I think that informs a lot of his writing. And one of my best Chinese friends says, well, what's the situation in China today with this appalling sort of, if we opened a Chinese-style factory, say in Trenton, it would be shut down tomorrow. I mean, you're not allowed to lock the people in there, not pay them, have them breathe toxic fumes and so forth, baking Christmas decorations. However, they can do that in China, and we can buy the goods. We couldn't buy them if they were made in Trenton, because that would be illegal. But we can buy them if they're made in China. Now, why that is, I'm not exactly sure, but it's got something to do with it's all very far away or something along those lines. One of my Chinese friends, who was formerly, I think he was director or vice director of the Institute for Theoretical Studies of the Central Party School, and who's someone who's always believed in freedom and has been a major communist figure. He says, if you want to understand China today, read The Condition of the Working Class in England by Marx. So I won't dismiss the moral dimension of Marxism. Yes, sir.
In the absence of a moral order, what's the kind of practical basis for reaching criminal law? I mean, if some high party official simply murders his wife, what's the excuse for prosecuting them?
Well, I think this is really a very interesting issue, but because you would think that things like criminal codes and everything would be straightforward. Yet, in fact, prosecution is highly selective. Years ago, when I was in China, there was a wave of executions because there was so much violence going on that they adopted the approach of you get somebody and say that he's the violent criminal and have everybody come out and shoot them. When you go into an apartment house, and there'll be a little placard saying, tomorrow at such an hour, you all got to go to the quarry because we're going to bring this murderer down and we're going to shoot him and so forth and so on. And then after the execution has been carried out, big placards go out which describe the crime, and then they have a box and there's a big red check mark in it. I once found one floating in the wind, and I thought, God, I should just take that and fold it up and put it in my pocket. Think how great it would look in my office. And then I thought, wait a second, Waldron, get a grip. If you get caught doing that, you're going to be in serious trouble. But I've always sort of regretted not having it. But here's the thing. If you read the descriptions of the crimes, it's very, very difficult to understand in some cases who's guilty, who's innocent, for instance, whether there was provocation, whether this is an act of revenge, for instance, by a worker who feels he's been unjustly treated by a boss. The fact is that the courts in China operate at the instruction of the party. However, as our friend over here mentioned, there are law codes and there are things in the Constitution that say you've got to be represented by counsel. And I know now there's a whole group of lawyers, including a professor at the Peking Law School, who simply go into court and they say, well, it says here in the criminal code that the suspect must be produced in court represented by counsel. I'm his counsel. Please produce the suspect. And then the people have to sort of talk, and they say, well, you have to understand that although it says that, that isn't really how things are done. Don't you get it? And the guy says, no, why does it say this here? And of course, the person who, say, the professor from Peking Law School is far better educated in many cases than the judge or the so-called lawyers. And this is becoming a very serious problem because the whole thing is arbitrary. And the only solution is either to regularize it and have objective mechanisms and clear rules, in which case there's no role for the Communist Party, because the party's role is that it knows what's going to happen and therefore it can arrange things and intervene in a capricious manner. Or else you leave things in the hands of the party, which means you get utterly inconsistent jurisdiction. Now, I think if you looked, for instance, I haven't done it, but I think if you looked at how criminal cases are prosecuted or how official corruption is dealt with, well, we'll see what happens with Tibet. I mean, who's going to be punished, who isn't going to be punished? It's all who you know. I'm sorry to say, but I mean, it's interesting. In World War II, the word that came from Chinese was gung ho, all together. What's the word that's come from Chinese in the last 30 years? Or phrase? Guanxi. How many of you know what Guanxi, G-U-A-N-X-I, means? Personal connections. And that really has almost entered the English vocabulary. Anyway, yes, ma'am.
In some other communist countries where repression ends, you have ethnic or religious war as a consequence of the end of repression. Is there a potential for that also in China?
Well, I think there is very much a potential for that in China, but I don't think that religion is going to be the dividing line the way it is, say, between the Serbs and the Croats, who are really indistinguishable except for their religion, because the Chinese, which is to say the population of the eastern half of China, leaving out the Turks, leaving out the Tibetans, and the non-Chinese people, they have lots to disagree about. Regional issues, linguistic issues, the issue of corruption. There are all sorts of things that could lead to conflict. But I have a difficult time imagining a sort of ethnic cleansing of the Cantonese by the Shanghainese. Although I can imagine ethnic cleansing, say, by the Chinese against the Tibetans or against the Turks. Although the problem with the Turks is that they border directly on Central Asia and have lots of veterans of Afghanistan and so forth. So it's difficult, but I think this is a good point. There's another point which we don't have time at all to explore, which is to what extent religion is a basis of these conflicts and to what extent it's a kind of a guise for these conflicts. But I'm skeptical of the idea that, for instance, what happened in Yugoslavia had to do with what Warren Christopher called these immemorial ethnic hatreds. I think it had much more to do with the collapse of a robust civil government. Not that Yugoslavia ever really was that. But I mean, one of the reasons that we Americans can all get along is that we have well-defined individual rights. We have well-defined legal redress. If the police in New York mistreat some Haitian immigrant, there is a pretty good chance that the officers are going to end up in court. And that confidence, you don't think so? Well, I would claim, when I say about the United States, I think that the values that we espouse are very, very laudable. We don't live up to them by any means in every case. But I think the way I think of these things is that when governmental structures become dysfunctional, and they're not sort of delivering the goods as far as governance goes, then things start to break down. And at that point, people are then thrown back and they say, who do I really trust? I can't trust people just on the basis that we're all American citizens. I have to say, I trust people from my hometown, or I trust people I grew up with, or I trust my family members, or I trust members of my ethnic group, or something like that. And that's how I interpret that. And Clark Macaulay, who's one of the great experts on ethnic violence, basically takes the same view. that so-called ethnic violence isn't so much about ethnicity or about religion as it is about the failure to create genuinely functional government structures. Other question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment that I thought your description of Chinese criminal law sounded a good deal like American criminal law today. I speak as a lawyer.
Well, I sort of suspected that.
We now have torture. We're trying to do away with habeas corpus. We have rendition. In Texas, the payment for a defense for a capital case is $25 an hour. President Bush sat over 150 executions, not one pardon. Now, if you go to Cuomo, who was a governor preceding that, not one execution. So we've got a system that's very much in disarray or is buried in the same way you described China.
Well, I think that there really is, one of the Marxist doctrines is the transformation of quantity into quality. And this is one of the three laws of dialectical materialism, the first being the interpenetration of opposites, the second being the transformation of quantity into quality, and the third being the negation of the negation, for those of you who had forgotten. I would argue that there really is a qualitative difference between a system in which judges are instructed about verdicts by a party advisor, in which there are no jury trials at all, in which which you don't even see the defendant, and so forth and so on. There's a qualitative difference between that, administered. Remember the word in law, in Chinese, xing, or then that means punishments. But fa, you can translate, the ministry of the judiciary, you can just as well translate it as the ministry of punishments. It's administrative punishments. There is a qualitative difference between that and the structures that we have in place. But having said that, I think that all of the examples that you have given are very worrying, because there is nothing magical which says that the United States is going to continue to be a free country or that we're going to continue to have justice. That's something that we all have to guarantee. I mean, as I tell my students, the country was not put here by the ancestors as a sort of free good for everybody to live off of. Every generation has to buy in to the values, not the practices that you're talking about, but buy into the values and then fight the battles that are involved in making them real. So I've never done, the night court sort of rookie reporter kind of thing, but I know that I'm aware that a lot of dubious stuff goes in. I work in Washington sometimes, and Washington is incredibly corrupt. One thing that's been astonishing is how corrupt it is. It's just corrupt beyond belief. And people will say, well, Arthur, Nigeria is corrupt. And I'll say, well, is it more corrupt than Washington? And they'll say, yeah, it really is. And I say, well, I really find that hard to imagine. Well, there's plenty of injustice in this country, but there are countries that are worse. That's all I would say. And I wish you luck in trying to make our country live up to its ideal. Question in the back. Yes, sir.
How do you see values and value systems evolving over the next 20 to 30 years in China?
Well, now there's a short answer. I think that as has happened, well, here's the thing. If you look at the transition out of communism, there are some places like, say, Slovenia, which was never a state, where it was quite successful. I think in Germany it was reasonably successful, although I think the economic policies didn't work. The Czech Republic, very, very successful. The Soviet Union, really not very successful at all, although there's far more private property and there is still more freedom than there was under the communists. But the graph is definitely not moving in the right direction. My own view is that China missed an opportunity to reform herself in the late 80s. China was really becoming very free in the late 80s. That was when you got the democracy movement. Those people were peaceful. They were not anti-foreign. It was it's the only example I can think of a mass movement in China that did not become xenophobic. It was it was very humane. People were shocked by the massacre. But at that time, corruption was not deeply rooted in China. So that if you were corrupt, that meant maybe you had a girlfriend, maybe you had a car that was bigger than you should have. In the decades that have followed, corruption, in the sense of the massive transfer of what are in theory national assets to private individuals, their expatriation. We were talking over dinner about how Mercer County is the favored destination of communist officials. They own lots of real estate around here, whereas the nationalists preferred Long Island. This has become very entrenched. So you now have a class at the top who stand to lose a great deal should there be any change. They have hundreds of millions of dollars, vast amounts of money. So they've got a huge, that didn't exist in the 1980s. That means that any attempt to change is going to be resisted by these newly created, entrenched, corrupt interests. And what that suggests to me is, of course, these people are not popular with the mass of people. There is a very strong sense that to get rich in China involves compromising yourself. There are entrepreneurs who have gotten rich by hard work, but the best way to get rich is to steal money from the government. There's now tremendous inequality between regions and between peoples. All of this could explode. It may be that a peaceful transition will become possible, but I think that a great deal has to be rethought. It has to be thought through again. And one of the things that has to be factored in is something that wasn't factored in initially, which is what is legitimacy? Where does person A get the right to rule person B? I remember during the election in Taiwan in 2000, I was in China, I was in central China, and I said to a couple of my friends at the university, do you think you folks here, do you think you could elect your own mayor? And they said, are you kidding, Arthur? Of course we could elect our own mayor. We'd elect one who's a hell of a lot better than this bum we have now. And then I said, do you think that you Chinese could elect your own president? And they said, what do you think we are? You know, nitwits? Of course we could do that. Of course we could elect a Congress. There's a wide awareness that at a certain level legal processes and constitutional and electoral processes are fundamental to legitimation. But there's absolutely no sign of movement in that direction. And underlying all of that are ideas like fairness. Where do they come from? Justice. Where do they come from? Well, they come somehow out of values. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, do you think that the movements in Tibet are religious-based primarily, or a nationalist movement, or just a mixture of both, or other motives?
Well, Tibet, of course, was independent of China for most of history. It became part of the Qing Empire. China was also part of the Qing Empire, so was Mongolia. The Qing administered Tibet very carefully. They didn't allow Chinese people to go there, and they said it is important that the people of Tibet know of the Dalai Lama, of whom the Chinese made themselves patron, but they shouldn't know about the government. Now, the communists initially attempted to adopt that approach, but during the Great Leap Forward in the 50s, there was an attempt to Sinify the Tibetans, and the Tibetans are not Chinese, and they don't want to be Chinese. And one of the sad things that happened was that the People's Liberation Army went in there, about 3,000 lamaseries in Tibet, say in 1955. By the 1960s, there were only 3 left. The others had all been dynamited. And I ask you, what would we be saying today? And we still say bad things about the Nazis. Suppose that they'd blown up every cathedral in France. We'd still be hearing about that. And in effect, this is what the communists did in Tibet. And this led then to an uprising, which was brutally crushed, and then to a policy of trying to deal with ethnic problems by flooding areas with ethnic Chinese. And that, what's going on in Tibet is many things. I think partly it's simply that they're exhausted, that they feel that their nationhood is being diluted and dissolved and destroyed. The Chinese have kidnapped the Panchen Lama, and they have substituted another young man in his place. The Karmapa Lama has escaped to India. They really have their backs to the wall. Now, the thing about the Tibetans is that they're scattered all over the place in these mountains. And they're not like the students in 1989 who conveniently lined themselves up in a square where you could, shoot at them. We're talking 1 million square miles if we're talking about, the whole of Western China, Greater Tibet, Greater Turkestan, and so forth. And it is very hard, even with rapid reaction units, even with helicopters, even with all sorts of technology for snooping and so forth, it's very hard to put a clamp down on every single place. And it was quite interesting that today the Chinese government, having vilified the Dalai Lama for many years, so I think it's quite unfair that they've said they'll talk to him if he will renounce Tibetan independence and call for nonviolence. Well, that's been his position for 20 years. But they've been saying he planned the whole thing. Well, the first point is that he no longer has any influence. Only the old people believe in him, the young, et cetera, et cetera. He has no influence, but on the other hand, he has organized all of these protests. And people who are in the Tibetan exile community, of whom I know, say that the government in Dharamsala is simply incapable of doing that. My own view is that this is going to continue. This is going to rumble on. I think that our own American position, I've been rather saddened that President Bush hasn't spoken out more robustly about this. Angela Merkel, the president of Poland, and the president of the Czech Republic are the first. What's that? Germany. Yeah, I was saying Merkel is the chancellor of Germany, but also the president of Poland and the president of the Czech Republic have spoken out very clearly and said they're not going to the opening of the Olympics. Prime Minister Rudd from Australia was here the other day. He condemned it, and Bush simply nodded his head. Sarkozy has said maybe, well, I think our calculation was that the Chinese will do a job, they'll kill everybody quickly, they'll wipe up the blood, and then we can go back. But it seems to be spreading, and my own view is that it's going to continue to spread, and it's going to bring, here's what's really, there are many important things about it. It is the degree of success that the Tibetans have had would not have been anticipated, I think, by most people. It's going to inspire emulation by other people with grievances. The other point is that Hu Jintao, who is the leader of China now, was in 1989 the sort of Gauleiter of Tibet. And in 1989, while we were busy looking at the students being killed in Peking, there were protests in Tibet, which Hu put down basically by shooting everybody. And this was one of the things that caused the late Deng Xiaoping to choose Hu to be the second person after Jiang Zemin, after Deng Xiaoping. So I think that this hit them hard, kill them, clean up, and get back to the Olympic countdown strategy is Hu Jintao's personal strategy. And many of his closest associates came with him from Tibet. They were kind of a Tibet clique. Now, even in the Politburo of the Communist Party, there are people who don't like this, who think that this is a bad policy. And if Hu is shown to have been ineffective, then his position will become weak, and this could lead to an internal struggle within the Chinese leadership, which will in turn raise the question of, why are we doing this? Why don't we just leave these people alone? What is the justification? And furthermore, why are you, Mr. Hu, in charge instead of me? So what starts as a regional disturbance, because of Hu's particular connection with Tibet, can have repercussions right to the center. And once things begin to wobble at the center in China, then things begin to wobble all the way down. Connie, are you giving me some sort of signal?
Maybe one more question?
Well, all right, one more. I told her, I warned that I'll go on until the last. Yes, sir.
My one question is there any remnants of this early idea on the heaven and the sky that still remains in the current party? Or is the idea that you explained that in war kind of that you have to sort of show the right to war? Is that one of the driving motives in Tibet,
Well, that's a wonderful question. No one, to my knowledge, has addressed this directly, although in this book, China Marches West by Professor Peter Perdue, he makes this point. My own view is sort of close to what you're suggesting. If you are going to have the kind of militarized society which China has, in which military activity is valorized, it's constantly talked about, and so forth, and so on, you've got to be really tough. And if it's a dictatorship, that means if you're a dictator, you've got to either kill them or you've got to do nothing. But, you know, it's like Machiavelli says, you don't wound a prince. You know, you don't try to kill somebody, fail, and then have them go. They'll come back and get you. You have to do a clean job of it. When the Falun Gong was crushed, or was attempted to be crushed, there was a huge demonstration. 10,000 Falun Gong practitioners assembled outside of Zhongnanhai, the government headquarters, without the secret police having told Jiang Zemin that this was going to happen, because they didn't know. Because these guys, among other things, are very, very good with computers. Among the people who was, and all they were asking for was that their religion be allowed to register so that they could meditate. They weren't asking for a new constitution. They weren't asking for political power. All they were saying was, look, can we just have our meetings and do our meditation without having to have the secret police all over us? Among the people protesting was one of the members of the Chinese Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose son is an acquaintance of mine. He is a professor of computer science at a university near here. And I suspect that his talents are being lent to such causes as hijacking the Sinosat, that is the communications satellite which is run by China, through which all their communications go, and which has occasionally been taken over. How these people do it, I don't know. And they then stream their own stuff. And you can imagine if you're sitting in Zhongnanhai and you turn on the TV and it says, you know, Falun Gong is great, communism is bad, you turn to your security people and you say, what are you guys doing? And they say, well, sir, we're working on it, as, you know, as they say in the military. But I think that what you're getting at is the idea of sort of demonstrative violence, that if you can kill one person in a way that will scare everybody else, this is what in criminology is called generalized deterrence. Haul somebody up, say that they are the criminal, kill them, and then you won't have a crime wave. Well, that's not true. The way that it works is you have to catch the actual perpetrator. And if you catch the perpetrator and punish them, then the word goes out among perpetrators that the police are pretty good at catching perpetrators. But if you're just killing random people, perpetrators will say, look, I mean, this poor bastard was just killed, but I know perfectly well that I'm the one that, you know, that did that. So I think to a certain extent, the credibility of the party, which is, after all, claims an absolute and unqualified right to rule, is on the line. And there was a very interesting thing in the London Times a couple of weeks ago where their reporter in Chengdu said, there hangs about the whole repressive effort the sour tang of failure. That even though they've sent all these tanks and armored personnel carriers and helicopters in, that somehow they haven't solved the problem. And the Financial Times today had a very long piece about the same thing, that the repression just isn't working fast enough or well enough. And if that's the case, then the sort of martiality that you're talking about comes into question. Now, of course, one of the reasons that the Qing dynasty collapsed was that it couldn't defeat the Westerners. The chief reason for the collapse of the Nationalist Party was that it was unable to defeat the Japanese. Failure in warfare or failure in repression in China is very often an augury of a general political failure. So we'll end with that. Thank you all very much.